Think about a moment in your life when you knew something was wrong. Maybe it was a meeting at work where a decision was being made that you knew would fail, but everyone else seemed to agree. So you said nothing. Maybe it was a relationship, yours or someone else's, where the signs were obvious, where the truth was sitting right there in the open, and still nobody said a word. Maybe it was something more serious, a situation where someone needed help, where speaking up could have changed everything, and you stayed quiet. Most people carry at least one of these moments, a moment of silence they cannot fully explain, not because they didn't care, not because they didn't know, but because something stopped them, something deep and automatic and overwhelmingly powerful, shut them down before the words ever reached their mouth. That something has a name, it has a science, and it is far more common, far more deliberate, and far more dangerous than most people ever realize. Today we are going to go deep into the psychology of silence. Why good people stay quiet when the stakes are highest. Why intelligent people watch things go wrong and say nothing. Why entire groups of people can witness something terrible and collectively decide, without ever speaking to each other, to pretend it isn't happening. And by the end of this video, you will understand not just why this happens, but what it costs us when it does. To understand why people stay silent, we need to start with one of the most important and disturbing studies in the entire history of psychology. It begins with a murder. On March 13th, 1964, a young woman named Kitty Genovese was attacked outside her apartment building in New York City. The attack lasted over 30 minutes. She screamed. She called for help. And, according to early reports, 38 neighbors witnessed the attack from their windows. Not one of them called the police until it was too late. The story shocked the nation. Newspapers called it a symbol of urban indifference, proof that modern society had made people cold, disconnected, incapable of caring about strangers. But two psychologists, John Darley and Bib Latane, had a different theory. They didn't think the 38 witnesses were indifferent. They thought the presence of 38 witnesses was itself the problem. They designed a now famous experiment. Participants sat in separate rooms and communicated through intercoms, believing they were talking with either one other person, two others, or five others. During the conversation, one participant, who was actually an actor, pretended to have a seizure, calling for help in increasingly desperate tones. The results were striking. When participants believed they were the only one who could hear the emergency, 85% sought help within the first minute. When they believed one other person could hear, that number dropped to 62%. When they believed five others could hear, the response rate fell to just 31%. Same emergency, same sounds of distress, dramatically different responses. based purely on how many people the participant believed were present. Darley and Latané called this the bystander effect, and it remains one of the most replicated findings in all of social psychology. But what exactly is happening inside a person's mind during those moments? Why does the presence of others make us less likely to act and less likely to speak? The researchers identified two core mechanisms. The first is called diffusion of responsibility. When we are alone and something goes wrong, the responsibility to act belongs entirely to us. We feel it fully. It is heavy and it is clear. But when we are in a group, that same responsibility gets distributed, divided invisibly among everyone present. Each person feels only a fraction of the weight, and a fraction of the weight is much easier to set down. The second mechanism is called pluralistic ignorance, and this one is perhaps even more powerful because it operates in complete silence. Imagine you are in a meeting. A plan is being presented. Something about it feels wrong to you. The numbers don't add up. The logic has a gap. The risk has been underestimated. But you look around the room and everyone else looks calm. No raised eyebrows. No uncomfortable shifting in seats. No sign that anyone else sees what you see. So you think, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I'm missing something. If this were really a problem, surely someone would say something. And so you say nothing. What you do not know is that every other person in that room is thinking exactly the same thing. Everyone privately doubts. Everyone privately sees the problem. And everyone publicly projects calm. Because everyone else is projecting calm, the group has collectively talked itself into silence without a single word being exchanged. This is pluralistic ignorance, the phenomenon where everyone privately rejects a norm or belief, but publicly goes along with it because they assume everyone else genuinely accepts it. It is one of the most powerful forces in human social behavior, and it is almost entirely invisible while it is happening. Pluralistic ignorance explains why people stay quiet about things they are uncertain about. But what about things they are certain about? What happens when a person knows, beyond any reasonable doubt, that what they are seeing is wrong? This is the question that Solomon Asch set out to answer in the early 1950s. Asch recruited participants for what he told them was a vision test. They sat at a table with a group of other participants and were shown two cards. One card had a single line on it. The other had three lines of clearly different lengths, labeled A, B, and C. The task was simple. Which line on the second card matches the line on the first? The answer was always obvious. The difference between the lines was significant. Under normal conditions, people answered correctly more than 99% of the time. But Ash had a secret. Everyone else at the table, except the real participant, was an actor, a confederate, and on certain trials, all the Confederates would unanimously give the wrong answer. Clearly, obviously, unmistakably wrong. Then the real participants' turn came. What would you do? You can see the correct answer clearly. You have eyes. You are not confused. But six other people have just confidently stated something you know to be false. Across hundreds of trials, approximately 75% of participants went along with the group's incorrect answer at least once, and overall, people gave the wrong answer about 37% of the time, even when the correct answer was plainly visible. When Ash interviewed participants afterward, their explanations were revealing. Some said they genuinely began to doubt their own perception. They wondered if perhaps their eyes were deceiving them. Others said they knew they were right, but didn't want to stand out, didn't want to seem strange, arrogant, difficult. One participant described the experience this way. He said it felt like being the only person in a room who speaks a different language. You know what you think, but somehow everyone else's certainty makes your own certainty feel fragile. This is the essence of what social psychologists call normative social influence. The pressure to conform, not because you believe the group is correct, but because the social cost of disagreeing feels too high. And here is what makes this deeply important for understanding silence in the real world. The pressure to conform increases dramatically when the group is larger. Ash found that conformity peaked at around 3 to 4 people and did not increase much beyond that. You do not need a crowd to silence someone. You need just a few. The group is unanimous. If even one other person in the room breaks from the majority, just one, conformity drops dramatically. The presence of a single dissenter gives others permission to disagree. The person values their relationship with the group. People conform more with people they like, respect, or depend on. The closer you are to a group, the harder it is to be the one who says the thing no one wants to hear. Everything we have discussed so far happens in rooms, in small groups, in experiments, in meetings. But the psychology of silence does not stay in rooms. In 1974, German political scientist Elisabeth Noelle Neumann introduced a theory that explained how silence scales, how it moves from individuals to groups to entire societies. She called it the spiral of silence. Noelle Neumann's theory begins with a simple observation about human nature. People are intensely motivated to avoid social isolation. The fear of being ostracized, cast out from the group, ridiculed, rejected, is one of the deepest and most primal fears in human psychology. Research in neuroscience has shown that social rejection activates the same neural pathways as physical pain. Being excluded from the group genuinely hurts, biologically, measurably, in the same way a wound hurts. Because of this fear, Noelle Neumann argued, people are constantly scanning their social environment, looking for signals about which opinions are dominant and which are in decline, which views are safe to express, and which ones will make you a target. When a person senses that their opinion is in the minority or moving toward minority status, they tend to go quiet. They do not abandon their view necessarily. They simply stop voicing it. They retreat into silence. But here is where the spiral begins. As more people with minority views go quiet, the majority view appears even more dominant than it actually is. The silence of the minority makes the majority seem larger, louder, more universal. This creates a false impression of consensus, which makes even more people feel that dissent is dangerous, which drives more people into silence. The spiral tightens. The minority view becomes invisible not because fewer people hold it, but because fewer people express it. And in many social and political contexts, an invisible opinion might as well not exist. Noel Neumann's theory was developed in the context of political opinions, but the spiral of silence operates in every human environment: workplaces, families, friend groups, online communities. Have you ever been in a group chat where someone posted something you thought was wrong or unfair, and you noticed that most people either stayed silent or went along with it, and so you said nothing too? That is the spiral of silence in action. In a group chat, in real time, the truly unsettling implication of this theory is that silence is never passive. Every time a person chooses not to speak, they are actively contributing to the impression that the dominant view is more dominant than it is. Silence is not neutrality. Silence is a vote, cast quietly, cast invisibly, but cast nonetheless. We have talked about the silence that comes from fear of the group, but there is another kind of silence, arguably more dangerous, that comes from above. In 1961, Yale psychologist Stanley Milgram conducted what would become the most controversial experiment in psychology history. Participants were recruited for what they believed was a study on learning and memory. They were assigned the role of teacher. Another person, an actor, was assigned the role of learner and was taken to another room. The participant could hear the learner but not see them. The participant's job was to ask questions. Every time the learner gave a wrong answer, the participant was instructed to administer an electric shock, pressing a button on a machine that displayed voltages ranging from 15 volts, labeled slight shock, up to 450 volts, labeled simply XX. In reality, no shocks were administered. The learner was an actor whose responses were pre-recorded. But the participants did not know this. As the experiment progressed, the voltage levels were increased with each wrong answer. At 150 volts, the learner began protesting, demanding to be released. At 300 volts, he pounded on the wall. Beyond that, silence. A silence more disturbing than the protests. Whenever a participant hesitated or expressed reluctance to continue, the experimenter dressed in a gray lab coat, calm and authoritative, would say one of four phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. Before the experiment, Milgram surveyed psychiatrists, students, and ordinary people, asking how far they thought participants would go. The consensus was that virtually no one would go beyond 150 volts. Perhaps 1 in 1,000, a pathological sadist, would go all the way to 450. The actual results were devastating. 65% of participants, ordinary people, not extremists, not sadists, not people with any unusual psychological profile, administered the full 450 volts. They went all the way, despite hearing the protests, despite the silence that followed, because an authority figure in a gray lab coat told them the experiment required it. Milgram called this the agentic state, a psychological condition where a person stops seeing themselves as an autonomous agent responsible for their own actions and instead sees themselves as an instrument of someone else's will. In the agentic state, the question, "Is this right?" gets replaced by, "Am I doing what I was told?" And in that replacement, the conscience goes quiet. This mechanism does not require a laboratory. It operates in every hierarchical structure humans have ever built: corporations, governments, militaries, families, religious institutions. How many times have you seen something wrong at work and said nothing because of who was in the room, because the person doing it had a title, a rank, a reputation, because challenging them carried a cost? That is the agentic state. It is not weakness. It is not cowardice. It is a deeply wired psychological response to social hierarchy that has been part of human behavior since long before psychology had a name for it. We have spent a long time understanding why people stay silent. Now, we need to reckon with what that silence actually costs, not just others, but the person who stays silent. The research here is sobering. A 2009 study published in the Journal of Applied Psychology found that employees who engaged in what researchers called employee silence, withholding opinions, concerns, and suggestions from managers, reported significantly higher levels of psychological distress, lower job satisfaction, and a stronger sense of powerlessness over time. In other words, staying silent does not protect you, it costs you. The unexpressed thought does not disappear. It accumulates. Psychologist James Pennebaker spent decades studying the relationship between expression and physical health. His research consistently found that suppressing important thoughts and emotions, keeping secrets, withholding significant concerns, is associated with higher rates of stress-related illness, weakened immune function, and increased risk of depression. The body, it turns out, keeps the score of things the mouth never said. But the cost of silence extends far beyond the individual. Organizational research has documented what happens when silence becomes the culture of a company or institution. A 2003 study by researchers Elizabeth Morrison and Francis Millikan identified what they called organizational silence, a collective phenomenon where employees across an organization withhold concerns, ideas, and problems from management. Their research found that organizational silence is one of the most significant predictors of corporate failure, ethical violations, and catastrophic decision-making. The examples are not hard to find. The engineers who knew about the O-ring problem before the Challenger disaster. The employees who knew about the accounting fraud at Enron. The doctors and nurses who saw the patterns before medical scandals broke into the open. In almost every major institutional failure in modern history, when investigators dug into what happened, they found the same thing: people who knew, people who saw, people who calculated the cost of speaking and decided, consciously or unconsciously, that silence was safer. And collectively, those individual calculations produced catastrophe. This is the true weight of silence. It is not simply a personal decision. Every time a person chooses not to speak something true, they cast that silence outward, into the room, into the organization, into the world. And silence, like sound, travels. If staying silent is so natural, so deeply wired, then what is different about the people who do speak up? What separates the person who stays quiet from the person who raises their hand, sends the email, makes the call? Research on whistleblowers and moral courage offers some genuinely surprising answers. The first finding is counterintuitive. Studies consistently show that people who speak up in difficult situations are not, on average, less afraid than those who stay silent. They feel the same fear. They recognize the same social risks. The difference is not the absence of fear. It is what they do with it. Psychologist Cynthia France and her colleagues found that people who demonstrate moral courage in group settings share a particular cognitive habit. They tend to frame situations in terms of their future self, rather than asking, "What will happen if I speak up now?" They ask, "Who will I be if I stay silent?" That shift in time horizon changes everything. The short-term cost of speaking, the awkwardness, the conflict, the potential rejection gets weighed against a longer-term cost that most people in the moment forget to calculate. The cost of becoming someone who knew and said nothing. The second finding is about identity. Research by psychologist David Dunning found that people are significantly more likely to act on their values when those values are explicitly part of how they see themselves. Someone who thinks of themselves as an honest person is more likely to tell a difficult truth, not because honesty is easier for them, but because silence would create a gap between who they are and what they did. The third finding, perhaps the most practically useful, is about the power of moral momentum. Studies on groups that successfully challenge authority or norms consistently show that the first person to speak does not need to be the most powerful, the most senior, or the most eloquent. They simply need to be first. Once one person breaks the silence, the dynamic of the room changes completely. Remember Ash's conformity experiments. Just one dissenter dramatically reduced conformity across the board. The first voice does not need to win the argument. It simply needs to exist, because its existence gives everyone else permission to follow. This is why the psychology of silence ultimately comes back to individuals, not because the systemic forces we have discussed are unreal. They are profoundly real, but because systems can only maintain silence if individuals keep choosing it. There is a question worth sitting with after everything we have covered today. Not a comfortable question, but an honest one. Where in your life right now is there something something you see clearly, that you have been choosing not to say? Not because you lack the words, not because you lack the evidence, but because the group is quiet, or the authority is present, or the spiral has already started turning. And the cost of being the one who speaks feels higher than the cost of staying silent. The research we have covered today does not judge that calculation. The Bystander Effect, pluralistic ignorance, normative conformity, the spiral of silence, the agentic state, these are not flaws in broken people. They are features of the human social mind, refined over thousands of years of living in groups where belonging meant survival. But we do not live in those same conditions anymore. The cost of being cast out of the group is rarely death. The cost of disagreeing with an authority figure is rarely permanent. And the cost of staying silent to yourself, to the people around you, to the structures you are part of, is often far higher than it appears in the moment when the calculation is being made. The people who speak up are not superheroes. They are not indifferent to risk. They are simply people who have learned through reflection, through experience, through understanding exactly that the mechanisms we have unpacked today to make a different calculation. And that calculation begins with knowing why the silence was there in the first place. Now you know. Stay curious. Stay honest, especially when honesty costs something. And as always, that is just how we are wired.